Hi, Startup 260. Today we're going to talk about Simon JavaScript version. So to get started, we're going to open up Chrome and we're going to navigate and show you what the application looks like when it's done. So I'm going to go to simon.javascript cs260.click. And here's our app. You can see we've got all our styling from our CSS and also our structure from our HTML. And we can go ahead and log into the game. At this point, we're not actually requiring a password. We'll add that when we add the authentication to JavaScript. So I'm just going to put my name in here and push the login button. And then we can go ahead and play the game. If we push restart, then I'll do the little button dance there and I can follow what it does. It increments my count as I go. And oh, there you go. I got it wrong. You can see over here, I'm generating some placeholder data for my WebSockets of other people playing the games and what scores they're actually getting. And if I come over to my scores, you can see that I actually am remembering what scores were actually done and when they were done. And then on my About page, I haven't really got a bunch of JavaScript going on here, but I've got my placeholders for other things that will be coming in once we actually implement the services. So the main things we're adding here with JavaScript is the ability to actually remember your player name. So if I do Joe here, as my player name and push login, you'll see that it actually displays and remembers that I have Joe. The game interaction's working and it's actually populating the scores as I make them there. So let's go ahead and look at the source code to this. And in order to get the source code, I need to go out to the GitHub repository. So if I go out to GitHub Web Programming 260 and head over to my repositories and open that up and then grab the URL for the repository, copy that to my clipboard and then head over to my console application. And I'm in the directory I want to put all my source code. So I'm just going to do a git clone and then paste that URL right in there. That will bring it down and then I can change directory to it and bring up my VS Code by typing code and then period to help it to know that I want to edit this directory as a project. And I've got all my JavaScript code for Simon right here. So what we've done is we've added a few files, and these files are our JavaScript files. So our first one is the login file to handle that login interaction and remember what the username was. And then I've got my play file for actually playing the game. And then I've got my score JavaScript file for reading and writing the score information. So let's go ahead and look at login.js first. It's the easiest one. And all I've got here is a simple function which says login. It does a query selector on the document to read out of the document object model, the DOM, some element that has an ID of name. And if I go look at my HTML for my login, which is in the index.html, scroll past the HTML header and the header on the body, which just has my navigation links, and look at my main code for the login interaction, you can see that I've got an on-click event handler that's calling the login function. Now it's able to find this function because I've already included the script tag up in the header to actually load that JavaScript. So that references the login.js file, which is the one we were just looking at right over here, to actually bring this login function into the context that the browser is using to render the HTML. And then when that click handler is called, so when I click on the login button, it's going to call that function right there. And we can actually watch this happening if we go live with our application. So if we push go live right now, that'll bring up the browser again. And now it's navigating to localhost 127.0.0.1 and on port 5500, which is what the live server extension is using to communicate or over the network with. And if I type in a name here, Bud, and bring up my dev tools and go to the sources tab, and I can either navigate to it by coming over here and clicking on login, or I can just do Command P or Control P if you're on Windows to bring up the login.js file. And you can see that's my code right there. So I put a breakpoint on this, and then I come back over here and say login. Then that's going to actually hit my breakpoint, and it's going to get that element from there. and it's going to read out of that element the value which I typed in there, bud. Now, what I'm doing to remember this, since I don't have a server to actually authenticate with and store who's actually playing the game at the moment, is I'm using the local storage on the browser to do it. So if I come over here to Application and come over here to the local storage tab, you can see for this URL, I've actually got some values, key value pairs that I'm storing up here. And I've done this before, so I've got a username of HHH that's been stored in there before. So if I go back to my sources and actually execute, then I'm going to store in local storage the name username and then the value that I just typed in there, and push F10. And then come back to application, you can see that my username has now changed to bud. So it's storing that off there. And that local storage is persistent over the use of the browser. So if I close the browser down and start it up again, that's still going to be in local storage, which allows me to exist between the user actually playing the Simon game at different times. Now it's only local to this machine, so if I play the game on some other machine and use that same login name, bud, somewhere else, then it's not going to find it because it's only on this machine that it's storing. That's why it's local storage. Okay, so that's the source of it actually executing that. And then the last thing that it does there is it redirects the application to go from the URL that it's on, which is the index.html page, to actually go to the play.html page. And because that's relative, I don't have a slash on there or anything, it's just going to change out the resource for, instead of being index.html, it's going to make it go to play.html. And so if I execute that, F10, you can see that it automatically navigated over to my play page. Now you'll notice my JavaScript disappeared. And that's because that JavaScript is no longer loaded. The or the login.js file is no longer loaded because I went to a different page. And the play page doesn't load the play JavaScript file. It doesn't load the login JavaScript file, it loads the play JavaScript file. So if I go back here to my code, I can show you that here we were loading the login one, but if I go to the play HTML page, you can see that it is loading down here at the very bottom, the play.js file. Now, why was this script at the bottom instead of at the top? The reason is because this one is going to interact with the HTML as the actual code starts loading up. And so if it's not actually loaded after it's actually brought in all the HTML, then it's not going to know where those elements actually won't exist, so it can't actually load those elements into the JavaScript. So you either put it after the HTML that you want to load in, your script down there, or you can simply just put the defer keyword on your script, and then it will defer the loading of the JavaScript until the entire document has actually been loaded. Either way works. In this case, I just stuck it at the bottom to make it simple. But now when the play page loads, it's going to load all of those document elements, and then it's going to load my play script. And that's what we saw over in the browser. So let's go ahead and look at the play script to see what's going on here. The first thing that you're going to notice is that there's this description of the different buttons that you can use to press on. And what this is doing is it's referring to assets to actually load up the sounds that get played when you push on the buttons. And there's also a color associated with each of those buttons. So that's all that's doing. It's just an array of data for those. And then I've got a class, a JavaScript class, which actually handles the button display and has a constructor which remembers what the element that's associated with the button is, the HTML element, what color is by reading out of the description. And then it also loads the sound from the description that we had above. So each one of these sounds is going to get loaded into a different button. And then it sets what you want it to paint based upon, this is like the intensity or the luminosity of the actual button that's going to be printed there. So if we come down to the paint button, you can see that it's actually setting the background using the color HSL syntax to set the color, and then also the level that you want to display it at. And then it's setting the background of that element to that actual style there. So that's what paint does. Every time I call it, I can call it with a different luminosity, and that will make it brighter or dimmer. Then there's also a press function. So when you actually press the button, you can tell it how loud you want the volume to be, and it will create a promise and return that so that it actually paints it at a brighter color, plays the sound, and then paints it at a dimmer color, and then it resolves so that that promise that's getting returned from being pressed actually can continue executing asynchronously. The play sound button is similar to the press button, but it takes the volume that it wants to play, and it sets that volume. And then it actually calls the sound play function. Now what the sound play function does is it will go ahead and play the sound, and when it's done, it will call the function that you set for on end. And so all I'm doing here is I'm passing in the play resolve function from the promise that's being passed to the promise. And so it will just call back through, and the promise will resolve once it's finished playing it. And that way I don't keep going until the song has finished playing, and then the color gets put back to normal, and everything works in the proper synchronous order. So let's go look at the game now. That's happening here. And you can see that it's got buttons. It's got whether or not the player can interact with the game. It's got the sequence of where they are within the game. And then it's got where the player currently is playing back in that sequence. And then it's just got the global mistake sound that it's going to store whenever the user doesn't actually do things right. On the constructor for the class, it's going to create a map for all the buttons that the game is going to control. It's going to set that the player is not allowed to interact with it initially, and then that will change based upon how the gameplay is going on. It's got the sequence array of what the user is supposed to actually play back. Where that is, we're going to set it to 0, where the user is within that, and then we're going to load our mistake sound just by loading this file right here, error.mp3. And these are all over in my assets. So I've got all my sounds right here within the assets. Okay, so what it's going to do then on startup is it's going to query the HTML page, and it's going to find all the buttons that have that class on it, the game button one. So if we go back over to our play, we'll actually see that within our game, we've got 4 different buttons, and they all have that class on it, game button, and then the idea of what actual color they are. So that's going to get there's going to load each one of those up there, and it's going to assign the description in the order that it actually finds them to each one of those buttons. So it's going to call my button constructor, pass in those descriptions that we had up at the top here, 1 through 4, and then create a button for it and set those into our map array. And we're going to set the key to our map to the ID of the element so that we can find those again as the user actually pushes on them. They push on it, we'll get the ID of what it is, and we'll be able to push the correct button when that actually happens. Then the next thing we do is we do a query selector for the element that has a class of player name. And if we go back over here, we'll see that at the top we're displaying our player name with this span right here, and it's got a class of player name on it. And then we go and we get our player name from this function right here. So if we just jump down to where that is, all that's doing is it's calling off the local storage again, and it's getting the item using the key that we put in local storage before and returning whatever that value is. And if there isn't a value, then we're going to return just the name mystery player. So if we jump back at this point, then we're actually going to get our player name out of it, and we're going to set the text context of the text content of that element that we loaded before to be that. So all that does is just comes over here, we refresh this, and it puts in the name right here of Bud. And we can see this actually happen if we debug it. So if I bring open my play.js function, come down here to our game, and when this loads up right here, I can actually refresh this page. This is breakpoint's going to hit. We're going to get our selector for that element. So if I push F10 and then look at this, I've got this element, which is the span with player name class on it. I'm going to call in to get the player name. So if I step into that, and then it will read off to local storage and then step back out again. Then our value for that text content is now set to Bud, and you can see it actually set Bud over here again. So that's it actually loading up. I've got all my sounds loaded up for my button array. So if I come over here and look at my buttons, you can see I've got red, green, and blue, and red, green, blue, and yellow, and that they're pointing to a button object, and those button objects know what their key is, the value, and also whatever audio and a hue associated with that. So everything's loaded up and ready to go at this point. So let's go ahead and look at what happens when a button gets, let's go look at what the reset button does first, because this starts off the game actually playing. So on the reset button, it's going to set the allow player to be false while it sets the game up. It's going to set the player playback position to 0 because there's no buttons to actually put this point, and clear out the sequence that they're supposed to duplicate. It then calls update score and puts in this little placeholder value. That means they haven't got any score yet. And that does a similar thing to what the displaying the player name was, where it goes and gets the score element and then sets it to whatever score you want that to be. And then it does this little thing which is called a button dance, and it does this synchronously. So it's going to block until the button dance is done. So what does button dance do? If I come down here, all this does is it's got a couple for loops that tells how many laps you want to do, and by default it's going to do 1 lap, and it's going to push every one of the buttons. And it's going to pass in that it wants the sound to be 0. So it's not going to play any sound for the buttons. It's just going to highlight them when it does that button dance. And then it actually adds a new button to it. So if we go look at that, it's going to just go out and get a random button. And so it's going to, from the array, it's going to pull out all the values of it, convert it into array from the map that it currently is. And then it's going to do a random check to actually find any one of those buttons and just return that value from it. So that'll give us a random button. And then it's going to push the button onto the sequence so that it gets added to the sequence that the user has to reproduce. So if we go back from there, we cleared out our sequence, we added a new button, and now we're going to play the sequence. And all that does is just walk through the array right down here, waits half a second before it starts playing the sequence. It walks through the array of all the values within the sequence, and it presses the button by calling the button press method, waits a tenth of a second before it actually goes again. And if we go look at the press button, that's up here at the top in our button class, it does that pressing and playing that we demonstrated earlier. So that takes us through our sequence, and then we allow the user to actually play the game. When the user is actually playing the game, we're going to go to the press button element or function here, and we're going to tell it that there has been a button pressed at that point. So how do we get that event? If we go back over to our HTML, you can see down here on the button that we have an on-click handler, and this is going to the game, and it's calling press button with this, and this in this case is the button that actually gets pressed. So if we come back over to play, you can see our press button is getting called there. Press button gets called over to here. It's going to give the element that it actually got pressed on. We're going to use the ID of that element to get the buttons out of our button map, and then we're going to call the press button method on that, which in this case makes the volume 100%. So it's actually going to play the sound and display the lights for that press, and it will block synchronously until that button finishes playing its little song. And then we check to see if the user got it right. And we do this by comparing what's in the sequence at the current playback position to what ID they actually pushed. If they got it right, then we increment the player's playback position, and if they've gotten to the end of all the buttons they were supposed to push, then we add a new button to it and update the score by calling this update score button or update score method. And then we play the sequence, which includes the new button that got added on there, so that they can then follow that sequence again. And then we allow the user to play because it's time for them to actually push the button. If they got it wrong, then we come over here and we save off the score. So that's the highest sequence -1 that they actually got by calling the save score method. And then we play the mistake, and then we make the button dance go around twice so that they get an visual indication that they got it wrong. So if we actually go to the save score, we'll see what's happening there. And you can see that what it does is it gets the player name from the local storage, and then it sets then it loads out of local storage the scores array. And if the scores array actually exists within local storage, then it will parse it from the JSON representation that's in local storage off to the JavaScript object representation. And then it will call update scores with the username, the score, and the scores that were provided. If we go look at update scores, you can see all that this does is it walks through it and makes sure that we only keep 10 values of the score. And if that score is higher than the other ones, then it's going to push that on there. And once it's updated those scores, then it just sets it right back into local storage under the scores attribute what the stringified version of that object is. So that gets represented as JSON back in local storage so we can read it back out the next time we play. All right, so that's pretty much everything within the JavaScript that we need to cover. So let's go over to our browser and take a quick look at this again. So we're still debugging here, so I'm going to go ahead and push play. And I'm going to go down to our saving the scores right down here. So we're going to put a breakpoint on this, and I'm going to go ahead and play the game. So if I reset, and I can follow this a little bit here. So we got 2 greens, and then we're going to do green, green, and red. So green, green, and red. And then I'm going to make a mistake at this point. So my username is Bud. I made it 3 times, make a mistake. You can see my saved scores come off here. You can see that the scores being passed as 3. I'm getting my player name out of local storage, just like I did before. So I've got that username of Bud. I'm going to go off to local storage and read the scores out of there. So if we go over application tab and look at local storage, you can see that I've got previous values in here before. I've got 8, 9 of them right now. And so if we go back to our source and read that out of there, then I'm going to get that same textual array coming out of there. And because I have a non-nullish value there, it's going to parse those scores from the JSON representation into an object, a JavaScript object, which has all those values there. And then I'm going to call update scores with my new score, my username, and the scores that existed before. So if I step into that, get the current time, create a new score object, and then I'm going to walk through this here, through each one of them. And if my score is greater than it, then I'm going to splice it in there, which apparently was. So we say found was true. We don't need to push it on the end because we've already spliced it in. And if our scores, if we did more than 10, it would just drop the ones off the end. So we don't have to worry about that. We've got our scores coming out of here, and our new score is in there, right there. You can see Bud scored 3 on this date. So that's all our JavaScript manipulation of the scores. Come back out of here, and then we're going to play the button dance, play the mistake sound. Our button dance plays, and we're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and push F8 to let it just go ahead and run. If we go over to Scores tab now, we'll see that it's displaying all those scores there. And if we go look at the JavaScript for this, then you can see it's pretty simple. So when this JavaScript loads up, so every time the scores page is navigated to, it's got a reference to the scores element. It's got this function which will load the scores from local storage, and then it dynamically creates the table that has all the different rows and table cells to actually represent score element. And this gets called whenever the JavaScript gets loaded. So it's going to call load scores, load the table in there, and blow in all of these values. And we can put a breakpoint on this if we want to actually see that happening by putting that there and then just refreshing the page. Load got called. We actually have scores from the local storage. So we're going to step into this and just start building those elements. So I'm building the 4 different cells there for position, name, score, and date. And then I'm going to populate the textual values for each of those and then append the child onto the row. And then once all those cells are appended to the row, then I'm going to append the entire row onto the table body. And it just does that for each one of the values in there. So I can go ahead and push F8 now and let that run. And that's basically all the JavaScript for the application. We have JavaScript in the login page to get the username, within the play to display the username, and also to do the playing of the game. And then there's also the scores page for just loading the scores from local storage and rendering them there. There's one other place that I actually use JavaScript in here, and that's to do the placeholder for the WebSocket functionality that will come later. And to do that, all I did was at the end of the play page, I just have a set interval, which is at certain intervals that I specify here. So every 5 seconds, I'm going to load in a random score value somewhere between 0 and 3000, and then I'm just going to blast into my player message element this additional element which says, I scored whatever. And that's what actually shows up as we sit here on the play page and just let it wait for 5 seconds. So if we wait here for a couple seconds, we're going to see that blowing in right here. Boom, there it goes. And it just keeps doing that. And that's just there as a placeholder for my WebSocket functionality to come later. Okay, that's everything for JavaScript. We hope that you'll have lots of fun implementing JavaScript into your startup application, and we're looking forward to seeing what you do with it.